Sometimes life strips away everything you thought defined you, your home, your business, your sense of worth. For James and Elise Miller, that moment came when medical bills and a failing economy took their corner bakery and left them sitting on cold sidewalks with their two young daughters. They had owned that bakery for 15 years. Now they pray together each evening, hoping someone will notice their need. One chilly night, as they bow their heads in prayer, the Virgin Mary appears before them. She wears flowing blue and white robes and says nothing, only offers a gentle blessing before disappearing. What happens next changes everything for this family and their entire town. Small miracles begin appearing, meals left by strangers, job offers, doors opening when they seemed forever closed. But why did she choose them? And what greater purpose awaits this broken family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn family photograph, tucked deep in James Miller's jacket pocket, showed 4 smiling faces gathered behind a glass bakery counter. In it, 10-year-old Mandy wore flour-dusted aprons, while 8-year-old Sophie held a perfectly decorated cupcake. Elise's arms wrapped around both girls, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from building something meaningful with your own hands. James stood behind them all, his weathered hands resting on the old wooden rolling pin that had belonged to his grandfather. That photograph was 3 months old. It might as well have been from another lifetime. Now James sat on the cold concrete outside Murphy's Hardware, watching his breath form small clouds in the October air. The boarded storefront across the street used to be Henderson's Shoe Repair, another casualty of the economic downturn that had swept through Millbrook like a quiet plague. Mrs. Henderson had closed up 2 months after the Millers lost their bakery. The domino effect was unmistakable, though nobody talked about it openly. "Papa, my stomach hurts," Sophie whispered, pressing closer to his side. Her voice carried that particular quality children get when they're trying to be brave about something that frightens them. James pulled her closer, feeling the sharp edges of his own ribs through his worn flannel shirt. They'd shared a can of soup yesterday, their one meal. The day before that, Mrs. Chen from the corner market had quietly handed Elise a bag of day-old bread, refusing payment with a gentle shake of her head. Such kindnesses kept them alive, but barely. "I know, sweetheart. Mama's looking for food right now." Elise had walked to the Methodist church 6 blocks away, hoping their food pantry might open early. She moved slower these days, though she tried to hide it. The cancer treatments had ended 4 months ago, not because she was healed, but because they could no longer afford them. The irony wasn't lost on James that his wife had fought to save her life, only to lose everything else in the process. Mandy sat cross-legged on James's jacket, homework spread across her lap. She attended school sporadically now, when they could manage clean clothes and she had enough energy to concentrate. Her teachers knew something was wrong, but hadn't pressed for details. Small mercies. "Dad, do you think we'll have our bakery back someday?" Mandy asked, without looking up from her math worksheet. The question hit James like a physical blow. For 15 years, Miller's family bakery had been the heart of their world. They'd opened at 4:30 every morning, James kneading dough, while Elise prepared the display cases. By 6, the smell of fresh bread and coffee drew the first customers. Construction workers grabbing breakfast before job sites. Teachers stopping for their daily muffins. Elderly Mr. Kowalski, who came in every Tuesday for the rye bread that reminded him of his childhood in Poland. The bakery had been more than a business. It was legacy, community, identity. James's grandfather had taught him to bake in that same kitchen, passing down recipes written in faded ink on index cards. Elise had learned alongside him, her natural talent for decoration turning simple cakes into works of art that made children gasp with delight. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 3 breast cancer, the oncologist had said with practiced gentleness. Treatable but expensive. Insurance covered the basics, but basics weren't enough. The specialized treatments, the medications, the lost work time. It all added up. With merciless arithmetic, they'd mortgaged the bakery building, then taken loans against the equipment. When that wasn't enough, they'd sold their home and moved into the small apartment above the shop. James had worked longer hours, Elise had pushed herself through treatments, and for a while it seemed they might weather the storm. The economic downturn arrived like a second punch to someone already staggering. Customers had less money for fresh pastries and artisan breads. Corporate chains offered cheaper alternatives. Orders for special occasion cakes dwindled as families tightened budgets. The loyal customers remained, but loyalty couldn't pay commercial rent. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. The building's owner, facing his own financial pressures, sold the property to developers. The new owners wanted the Millers out, planning to convert the space into luxury condos. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. James remembered because it was rye bread day, and Mr. Kowalski had been there when the sheriff's deputy knocked. "We'll see, honey," James told Mandy now, the words feeling hollow. "Right now, we focus." On today, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty street. Millbrook had once been a thriving small city, the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might run businesses on the same block. Now, every third storefront sat empty, for lease signs gathering dust in windows. The young people, left for opportunities in bigger cities. The older residents held on with the stubborn hope of people who'd invested their entire lives in a place. Elise appeared around the corner, walking with the careful gait of someone managing pain. She carried a small paper bag that made James's heart lift despite everything. The church pantry had opened early. "They had peanut butter and jelly," she said, settling beside them with a soft grunt, "and some crackers. Sister Mary Catherine asked about you girls. She remembers when you helped with the Easter egg hunt last year." Sophie perked up at the mention of food, but Mandy's expression remained distant. At 10, she understood more than her younger sister about their situation. She'd heard the whispered conversations between her parents, seen the bills spread across the kitchen table in those final days at the bakery. Children shouldn't carry such knowledge, but circumstances don't respect childhood's boundaries. "Did you tell her we're staying at the shelter tonight?" Mandy asked. Elise and James exchanged glances. The shelter had space limitations and couldn't guarantee consecutive nights. They'd been turned away twice this week, left to sleep in the park or find doorways that offered some protection from the wind. "We'll figure it out," Elise said, with the kind of forced optimism parents use when they don't want their children to worry. "We always do." As evening approached and other families hurried home to warm dinners and comfortable beds, the Millers prepared for another night of uncertainty. They gathered their few possessions, a change of clothes in a worn duffel bag, Sophie's favorite stuffed rabbit, the homework Mandy was determined to complete despite everything. James felt for the photograph in his pocket, its edges worn smooth from his fingers. In 3 months, they'd fallen from small business owners to homeless wanderers. The speed of it still seemed impossible, like waking from a dream, only to find the nightmare was real. But tonight felt different somehow. As they walked toward the shelter, Elise reached for his hand, something she hadn't done in weeks. Her palm felt warm despite the cooling air. "James," she said quietly, "I think something's going to change soon." He wanted to ask what she meant, but Sophie was asking about dinner, and Mandy was worried about turning in her homework late. Family logistics took precedence over philosophy, as they always had. Still, Elise's words stayed with him as they made their way through the gathering. Dusk, hope, and desperation, walking hand in hand through the empty streets of a town that had forgotten how to dream. The shelter had been full again. Sister Patricia offered apologetic smiles and a promise to call if anyone left early. But the Miller family found themselves back on the street as the October night grew colder. They'd settled outside the old Murphy's Hardware building, using James's jacket as a makeshift blanket for the girls, while he and Elise huddled together for warmth. "Let's pray," Elise whispered, as the church bells chimed 9 o'clock. All together like we used to. In their bakery days, family prayer had been an evening ritual. The four of them would gather in the kitchen after closing, still smelling of flour and vanilla, and thank God for the day's blessings. It seemed like something from another world now, but Elise's voice carried a conviction that made James bow his head despite his doubts. They joined hands in a small circle on the cold sidewalk. Mandy and Sophie closed their eyes tight, their young faces serious with the weight of their family's need. James found himself looking at his wife as she began to pray, noticing how thin she'd become, how her wedding ring now slipped loosely on her finger. "Dear Lord," Elise began, her voice steady despite their circumstances, "we thank you for keeping us together as a family. We thank you for the food we shared today and for Sister Patricia's kindness. We ask for your guidance and protection through this night." Sophie's small voice joined in. "And please help other families who are cold like us." Mandy squeezed her father's hand tighter. "Please help us find a home again, God, and help Mama get better." James felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Part grief, part anger, part desperate hope. He'd built his life on the premise that hard work and faith would provide. Now both seemed to have abandoned him, leaving his family exposed to elements both physical and spiritual. "Amen," they whispered together. As they opened their eyes, something extraordinary happened. The air around them grew warm, impossibly warm for an October night. A gentle light seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, soft as candlelight, but bright as dawn. James blinked. Certain exhaustion was playing tricks with his vision. Then she appeared. A woman stood before them, perhaps 20 feet away. Her presence filled the empty street with an otherworldly peace that James felt in his bones. She wore robes of deepest blue, trimmed with white that seemed to glow with its own light. Her face was serene beyond description, ageless yet wise, with eyes that held infinite compassion. Sophie gasped and gripped James's arm. "Papa, who is that lady?" But James couldn't speak. None of them could. The woman's presence commanded a reverent silence that felt as natural as breathing. She raised her hands in a gentle gesture of blessing, her movements graceful as flowing water. Though she spoke no words, her message was clear. Peace, hope, you are not forgotten. Mandy began to cry, not from fear, but from overwhelming relief. "It's her," she whispered. "It's the Virgin Mary." The figure smiled with such tenderness that James felt years of anger and doubt crack open in his chest. For this perfect moment nothing else existed, no cold, no hunger, no uncertainty. Only this profound sense of being completely known and completely loved. Elise struggled to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Blessed Mother," she whispered, "thank you for coming to us." The Virgin Mary nodded once, then reached into the folds of her robe. She withdrew something small and blue, a rosary that seemed to capture and reflect the mysterious light surrounding them. With infinite care, she placed it on the concrete where they sat, then stepped backward. As she moved away, her form began to fade like morning mist, but her presence lingered. The warmth remained, and with it, a certainty that everything, somehow, impossibly, was going to be all right. James stared at the spot where she'd stood, his rational mind struggling to process what had occurred. "Did we all see that?" he asked hoarsely. "The pretty lady in blue." Sophie nodded solemnly. "She smelled like flowers." Elise reached for the rosary with trembling fingers. It was real, solid blue glass beads connected by silver chain, warm to the touch despite sitting on cold concrete. At its center hung a small medallion bearing the image of the Virgin Mary, identical to the figure they'd just witnessed. "James," Elise whispered, clutching the rosary to her chest, "do you understand what this means?" He wanted to find logical explanations, stress-induced hallucinations, shared delusions born from desperation. But the warmth still surrounded them, and the peace in his heart felt more real than anything he'd experienced in months. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed from around the corner. Mrs. Williams, the elderly woman who ran the corner grocery, appeared carrying a paper bag and wearing her nightgown under a heavy coat. "I don't know why," she said, approaching them with visible confusion, "but I felt compelled to bring this to you. I was sound asleep when someone told me to get up and make sandwiches." She handed Elise the bag, then noticed their faces in the streetlight. "Are you folks all right? You look like you've seen an angel." Elise met James's eyes, the rosary still warm in her palm. "Maybe we have." Mrs. Williams glanced around the empty street, shivered, and hurried back toward home. But her unexpected gift remained: 4 thick sandwiches, a thermos of hot soup, and cookies that smelled like the ones James's grandmother used to make. As they shared the miraculous meal, James found himself studying his family's faces. Sophie ate with the unself-conscious joy of a child who trusted completely in the goodness of the universe. Mandy kept glancing at the spot where the Virgin Mary had appeared, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And Elise looked transformed, as if the weight she'd carried for months had suddenly lifted. "What happens now?" James asked, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing his wife or something larger. Elise tucked the blue rosary safely in her coat pocket. "Now we trust," she said simply. "Now we see what miracles look like in ordinary time." The night no longer felt cold. As they prepared to attempt sleep against the building's brick wall, James noticed something else extraordinary. For the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. James woke to sunlight streaming across his face and the sound of Sophie giggling. For a moment, disoriented by actual warmth, he forgot where they were. Then the brick wall against his back reminded him, and he sat up to find his youngest daughter playing with something small and white. "Look, Papa," she said, holding up a folded piece of paper. "Someone left this while we were sleeping." The handwriting was neat, masculine, unfamiliar. "James Miller, please come to Patterson Construction, 4 and 12 Oak Street, at 8 a.m. today. Ask for Bill Patterson. There's work if you want it." James read the note 3 times. Patterson Construction was one of the larger companies in town, the kind of outfit that employed dozens of men and took on commercial projects. He'd never applied there, never even met Bill Patterson, yet here was a job offer appearing like morning dew. "How could anyone know our last name?" he asked Elise, who was helping Mandy fold their makeshift bedding. "The same way someone knew to bring us sandwiches last night," she replied, touching the rosary in her pocket. "Maybe we should stop asking how and start asking what we're supposed to do about it." By 7:30, James stood outside Patterson Construction, wearing his cleanest shirt and carrying the mysterious note. The building buzzed with early morning activity, work trucks loading equipment, men in hard hats discussing the day's projects. He felt acutely aware of his appearance, the way his clothes hung loose from weight loss, the desperation that probably showed in his eyes. "You Miller?" A stocky man in his 60s approached, coffee mug in hand, and genuine curiosity in his expression. "Yes, sir. James Miller. I received this note." James handed over the paper, half expecting Patterson to claim no knowledge of it. Instead, the older man nodded slowly. "Bill Patterson. I wrote that note myself, though I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure why." He gestured toward his office. "Trailer? Let's talk." The trailer was organized chaos, blueprints pinned to every wall, coffee-stained schedules, and the comfortable mess of a working man's space. Patterson poured James coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since dawn. "I've been in construction 43 years, Patterson said, settling behind his desk. "Built half the commercial buildings in this county. Yesterday, I woke up from a dead sleep at 3 a.m. with your name in my head. Don't ask me how I knew your last name or where you'd be sleeping, because I can't explain it." James sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "I worked construction in my 20s, before I opened the bakery. Residential mostly, some commercial." "Framing. Yeah, I heard about the bakery. Shame what happened to you folks." Patterson leaned back in his chair. "Look, I'm not a religious man, Miller. Haven't been inside a church since my wedding 30 years ago. But something told me to hire you, and I've learned to trust my instincts. The job was simple enough, general labor, some carpentry if James's skills proved solid. The pay wasn't generous, but it was steady. More importantly, Patterson offered to advance James enough money for a week's lodging at the Riverside Motel. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" James asked. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee. "My daddy lost his farm during the Depression. I was about your little girl's age. I remember what it felt like to watch my parents try to hold everything together." He looked up at James. "Maybe someone helped us once, and now it's my turn to pass it along." James wanted to ask more questions, to understand the mechanics of this sudden good fortune. Instead, he simply said, "When do I start?" "Right now, Tommy. We'll get you equipped and show you the Roosevelt Elementary renovation project." The work felt good. Physical labor that occupied his hands and gave his mind space to process the previous evening's events. Tommy Brennan, the foreman, proved to be a patient teacher who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about James's recent circumstances. The other workers accepted him with the easy camaraderie of men who understood that everyone carried their own struggles. During lunch break, James called Elise from Patterson's office phone. Her voice carried an excitement he hadn't heard in months. "James, you won't believe what happened. Sister Patricia came by around 10 o'clock and said the church has an opening for a part-time kitchen assistant. Someone donated money specifically for the position, and they asked if I'd be interested. More mysterious generosity, more inexplicable timing." James was beginning to understand that the Virgin Mary's appearance had set something in motion, like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in ways they couldn't predict or control. "There's something else," Elise continued. "Mrs. Williams from the grocery store. She came by with bags of food. Said she had a dream last night about feeding hungry families. James, she was crying when she told me. She said she's never had dreams like that before." That evening, the Miller family sat around a small table in their motel room, the first private space they'd shared in weeks. The room was modest, but to them it felt luxurious. Hot showers, clean beds, a door that locked. Sophie had immediately claimed the chair by the window, fascinated by the view of the parking lot that represented normalcy. Mandy spread her homework across the second bed, finally able to complete assignments without worrying about wind or curious strangers. For the first time in weeks, she looked like the 10-year-old she was supposed to be. "Mama," Sophie said as Elise brushed her hair, "will the pretty lady come back?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think she's still watching over us." James sat on the bed's edge, observing his family's transformation. In 24 hours, they'd gone from homeless desperation to cautious stability. The change felt miraculous, but also fragile, as if one wrong move might cause their good fortune to evaporate. "Elise," he said quietly, "what if this is all coincidence? What if people are just being kind, and we're reading more into it than we should?" She looked at him with the patient expression she'd perfected during their 15 years of marriage. "James, does it matter? Whether it's coincidence or miracle, our family is sleeping in beds tonight instead of on concrete. You have work tomorrow. I have work next week, and our daughters are safe. Sometimes Grace looks ordinary, sometimes it wears work clothes and offers practical help." Later, as Sophie and Mandy slept peacefully in the second bed, James lay awake, listening to his wife's steady breathing. The blue rosary sat on the nightstand, catching streetlight from the window. He'd built his adult life on rational thinking, careful planning, and incremental progress. The past day had challenged all of those assumptions. But Elise was right about one thing. Whatever forces had aligned to help them, the results were undeniably real. Tomorrow he would return to Patterson Construction, honest work that would allow him to provide for his family. Elise would begin exploring her new position at the church. They would take their daughters to school and begin rebuilding the ordinary. routines that defined normal life. The Virgin Mary had appeared for less than 10 minutes, but her presence seemed to be unfolding in ways that would take much longer to understand. By the end of the week, James had fallen into the rhythm of construction work. Early mornings, honest sweat, the satisfaction of tangible progress. The Roosevelt Elementary renovation was ahead of schedule, and Patterson had mentioned the possibility of permanent employment if James proved reliable. More importantly, the steady paycheck allowed them to extend their motel stay and begin planning beyond mere survival. Elise's position at the Methodist Church had blossomed into something neither she nor Sister Patricia had expected. What began as kitchen assistants had evolved into informal counseling for other families struggling with crisis. Elise possessed a natural gift for listening, for offering hope without minimizing pain. The church's small food pantry had seen increased donations since she'd started working there, as if her presence somehow attracted generosity. "People want to help," she told James one evening as they shared takeout Chinese food, their first restaurant meal in months. "They just don't always know how. Sometimes they need someone to show them where the need is." The girls were adapting to stability with the resilience of children. Sophie had made friends with the motel manager's granddaughter, and their laughter could be heard echoing around the pool area each evening. Mandy had caught up on her missed assignments and was participating in class discussions again, her natural curiosity re-emerging as stress diminished. But it was Sophie's drawings that truly captured attention. She'd always been artistic, but her recent sketches possessed an unusual quality that made adults pause and stare. Her crayons seemed to capture details that an 8-year-old shouldn't notice. The exact folds of the Virgin Mary's robes, the specific shade of blue that matched neither sky nor ocean, but something altogether more ethereal. Father Rodriguez, from St. Vincent's Catholic Church, had visited the Methodist Church specifically to see Sophie's artwork. The elderly priest studied each drawing with scholarly intensity, asking gentle questions about colors and symbols. Sophie answered with matter-of-fact directness that made adults exchange meaningful glances. The pretty lady had a star on her. "Dress right here," Sophie explained, pointing to a detail in her latest drawing. "And her hands were like this because she was showing us love." Father Rodriguez showed the drawing to James and Elise privately. "I've studied religious art for 40 years, he said quietly. "These details, the positioning of the hands, the specific iconography, they're consistent with traditional depictions of Marian apparitions. Details your daughter couldn't have learned from coloring books or children's illustrations." James found himself studying Sophie's drawings with new eyes. The innocent artwork suddenly seemed like evidence, documentation of something that challenged his understanding of how the world worked. Each sketch felt like a small miracle, proof that their extraordinary encounter had been real. The ripple effects continued expanding in unexpected directions. Mrs. Williams, the grocery store owner who'd brought them sandwiches that first night, had become a regular visitor to their motel room. She brought food, certainly, but more than that, she brought stories. Since her dream about feeding hungry families, she'd been experiencing what she called promptings, sudden urges to help specific people in specific ways. "Yesterday, I felt compelled to pay off the Hendricks family's electric bill," she told Elise, shaking her head in wonder. "I don't even know them well, just seen them around town. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they needed help. Turns out their power was scheduled to be shut off today. Tommy Brennan, the construction foreman, had his own story. His teenage son, who'd been struggling with depression and talking about dropping out of high school, had suddenly announced his intention to volunteer at the animal shelter. When Tommy asked what changed his mind, the boy said he'd had a dream about helping creatures that couldn't help themselves. "These kinds of dreams are spreading," Tommy told James during their lunch break. "My wife's been talking to other women in town. Half of them have had unusual dreams in the past week. Dreams about kindness, about helping neighbors, about finding purpose. It's like something's waking people up." The most significant change came from an unexpected source. Thomas Brennan. No relation to Tommy, was Millbrook's wealthiest resident, a retired businessman who'd made his fortune in real estate development. He lived in the largest house on Elm Street and was known for his skepticism about religion and charity alike. Brennan arrived at Patterson Construction on a Thursday afternoon, driving his expensive sedan and wearing the kind of suit that announced financial success. He asked to speak with James privately, his manner formal but not unfriendly. "I've been hearing stories about your family," Brennan said without preamble. "Unusual stories. I'm a practical man, Miller. I believe in evidence, in rational explanations. But I'm also curious about phenomena that don't fit conventional understanding." James wasn't sure how to respond. "What kind of stories?" "Stories about dreams, about sudden generosity, about people acting contrary to their established patterns. Stories that seem to originate from the night your family claims to have seen a religious figure." Brennan's tone remained neutral, neither mocking nor believing. "I'm proposing an investigation. The investigation would be informal but thorough." Brennan wanted to document the recent changes in community behavior, interview people who'd experienced unusual dreams or impulses, and examine whether there was any logical pattern to the events surrounding the Miller family. "What's your motivation?" James asked. "Intellectual curiosity," Brennan replied. "If something extraordinary is happening in this town, I want to understand it. If it's mass, psychology, or coincidence, that's worth knowing too. Either way, the truth is valuable." James agreed to cooperate, partly from curiosity and partly from a growing sense that their story was becoming something larger than their personal experience. That evening, he discussed Brennan's proposal with Elise. "Are you comfortable with someone investigating what happened to us?" he asked. Elise considered the question while braiding Mandy's hair. "I think truth can withstand investigation," she said finally. "If what we experienced was real, and I believe it was, then careful examination will only confirm that. And if it helps other people understand what's happening in their own lives, maybe that's part of why we were chosen." Sophie looked up from her latest drawing, another depiction of the Virgin Mary, this one surrounded by small figures representing the people of Millbrook. "Mama, is the man going to find out that the pretty lady is real?" "I think so, sweetheart. I think that's exactly what he's going to find out." As October gave way to November, the Miller families settled into their new routines. James's work was steady, Elise's position at the church was becoming permanent, and the girls were thriving in stable environments. But beneath the surface of returning normalcy, something profound continued to unfold. The town of Millbrook was changing, one dream and one act of kindness at a time. And at the center of it all, a blue rosary sat on a motel nightstand, silent, witness to the ongoing miracle of ordinary people learning to see the sacred in their everyday lives. The vintage church hymnal appeared on a Tuesday morning, left outside their motel room door like a gift from an unknown benefactor. James discovered it while heading to work, its worn leather cover soft with age and use. Inside the front cover, someone had tucked a prayer card bearing the date of their Virgin Mary encounter, October 15th, in faded ink that looked decades old. "How is that possible?" James asked Elise over breakfast. "That prayer card was printed before we were even born, but it has the exact date of our experience." Elise examined the hymnal with reverent care. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with traditional songs she remembered from childhood Sundays with her grandmother. On page 127, she found a hymn called "Mary, Mother of Grace," a song she'd never heard before, but somehow knew by heart. "Maybe time works differently when heaven touches earth," she said softly. "Maybe some things are prepared long before we understand why we need them." The hymnal's arrival coincided with James's growing spiritual awakening. 3 weeks of steady work had restored not just his financial stability, but his sense of purpose. Each morning at Patterson Construction, brought new evidence of his expanding role in the community's transformation. Yesterday, a co-worker named Frank Kowalski, grandson of the old man who used to buy rye bread every Tuesday, had approached James during lunch break. Frank's wife was battling addiction, and their marriage was crumbling under the weight of her disease and his anger. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Frank had said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I'm not even religious, but people say your family saw something, someone, and ever since then, good things have been happening to folks around here. I was wondering if maybe you could, I don't know, pray for us or something." James had felt completely unqualified to offer spiritual guidance. 6 months ago, he'd been questioning whether God existed at all. Now, people were asking him to intercede on their behalf, as if proximity to the Virgin Mary had granted him some special access to divine favor. But when Frank's wife entered rehabilitation 3 days later, funded by an anonymous donor who paid her full treatment costs, James began to understand that his role wasn't to provide answers, but to be present for the questions. The prayers mattered less than the fact that someone cared enough to offer them. Elise's position at the Methodist Church had evolved in similar ways. What began as kitchen work had expanded into an informal ministry for struggling families. She'd developed a network of volunteers who responded to what they called promptings, sudden, unexplained urges to help specific people in specific ways. The network operated without formal structure or regular meetings. Instead, Elise served as a central contact point for people who felt moved to donate time, money, or resources. A retired teacher might call to say she felt prompted to tutor children whose families couldn't afford academic help. A local mechanic might offer to repair cars for single mothers who couldn't pay full price. The generosity was spontaneous, targeted, and remarkably effective. "It's like watching prayer become action," Elise told James. "People pray for guidance about how to help, and then they receive very specific instructions about who needs what kind of assistance." The most dramatic example involved the Hendricks family, the same family Mrs. Williams had helped with their electric bill. David Hendricks worked 2 part-time jobs but couldn't afford his diabetic son's insulin. The family faced an impossible choice between medication and rent money. Then Margaret Foster, a retired nurse who barely knew the Hendricks family, experienced a vivid dream about diabetic children. She woke with complete certainty that she needed to contact the pharmaceutical company that manufactured insulin. When she called, she discovered they had an assistance program for low-income families, but the program was barely publicized and had strict application deadlines. Margaret spent 3 days helping David navigate the application process. The gay family qualified for free insulin for an entire year, potentially saving thousands of dollars and certainly saving their son's life. "I never would have known about that program," David told Elise, tears streaming down his face. "We were going to lose our apartment. I was going to have to choose between my son's medicine and keeping a roof over our heads. Now we can do both. And I don't understand how this happened." Stories like David's were becoming common throughout Millbrook. The town's social services coordinator, a practical woman named Joan Foster, who happened to be Margaret's sister, started documenting the assistance being provided through what she called the prayer network. Her preliminary report was staggering. In the month since the Miller family's Virgin Mary encounter, volunteer assistance in Millbrook had increased by 400%. Food pantry donations had tripled. The number of families receiving help with utilities, rent, and medical expenses had quadrupled. Most remarkably, the assistance was precisely targeted. Families received exactly the kind of help they most desperately needed, often just before crisis points. "I've worked in social services for 20 years, Joan told Thomas Brennan during one of his investigation interviews. "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if someone with perfect knowledge of each family's situation is coordinating a response to their specific needs." Brennan's investigation was progressing methodically. He'd interviewed 43 residents, documented 67 instances, of unusual dreams or promptings and tracked over 200 acts of community assistance. The data revealed patterns that challenged his systematic skepticism. The phenomena appeared to be radiating outward from a central point, he told his research assistant, a retired professor named Dr. Elizabeth Ward. Patient zero, if you will, is the Miller family's reported encounter on October 15th. The further we get from that date and location, the fewer anomalous experiences we document. Dr. Ward had her own theories. Mass psychology can explain some of this. The power of suggestion, community contagion, of altruistic behavior, but the specificity troubles me. How does Mrs. Williams know that the Hendricks family needs help with electricity? How does Margaret foster dream about diabetic children she doesn't know exist? The investigation had attracted attention beyond Millbrook. Father Rodriguez had contacted the diocese office, reporting the unusual religious phenomena and requesting guidance. A team of church investigators was scheduled to arrive within the month to conduct formal interviews about the reported apparition. Meanwhile, Sophie's artwork continued to astound adults with its theological accuracy and symbolic depth. Her latest drawing showed the Virgin Mary surrounded by interconnected circles representing the families of Millbrook, with golden lines connecting each circle to the others. When Father Rodriguez showed the drawing to his theological professors, they noted its similarity to medieval depictions of divine providence working through human community. Your daughter is illustrating concepts that require graduate-level theological training to understand, Father Rodriguez told James and Elise. Yet she draws them as naturally as other children draw houses and trees. As November progressed, James found himself at the center of something far larger than his family's personal salvation. People sought him out for prayer, for advice, for the simple comfort of talking to someone who'd witnessed the impossible. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but it also felt right, as if his lifelong preparation for this role had included everything from running a neighborhood bakery to losing everything and learning to trust again. The vintage hymnal remained. On their nightstand, its prayer card marking the date when their ordinary lives had intersected with the extraordinary. Each evening, the family gathered to read its pages, learning songs that seemed to have been waiting specifically for their voices. The old community newspaper clippings surfaced in the most unexpected place, tucked inside a library book that Mandy had checked out for a school report. The yellowed paper showed a photograph from 15 years earlier, James and Elise cutting the ribbon at Miller's family bakery's grand opening, surrounded by smiling neighbors and local officials. "Look at us," Elise whispered, studying their younger faces. "We were so hopeful, so certain we knew what the future would bring." The newspaper's headline read, "New Bakery Brings Sweet Dreams to Oak Street." James remembered that day with painful clarity, the pride of ownership, the sense of contributing something meaningful to their community, the naive belief that hard work would always be enough. Now, studying the photograph, he saw the cyclical nature of their journey with new eyes. They'd built something beautiful, lost it, and were now part of building something even more significant. The bakery had fed bodies. Their current mission seemed to be feeding souls. Thomas Brennan's investigation had taken an unexpected turn. What began as intellectual curiosity had evolved into something approaching conversion. The businessman's systematic documentation of miracles had led him to experience his own transformation. "I spent 3 weeks trying to debunk what's happening here," he confessed to James during an evening visit to the motel. "I interviewed skeptics, looked for rational explanations, searched for evidence of fraud or mass hysteria. Instead, I found more miracles." Brennan's most recent discovery involved the Riverside Motel itself. The establishment had been struggling financially, with occupancy rates dropping each month as economic conditions worsened. Since the Miller family's arrival, however, the motel had experienced an unprecedented boom. Families from neighboring towns were driving to Millbrook specifically to visit the miracle site where the Virgin Mary had appeared. They wanted to pray on the sidewalk where it happened, to meet the family who'd witnessed the encounter, to participate in what many were calling a spiritual revival. The manager, Mrs. Foster, Margaret's cousin, who seemed part of an extended network of helpful Fosters, was booking rooms weeks in advance. She'd hired additional housekeeping staff and was considering expanding the restaurant to accommodate the increasing number of visitors. "I've been running this motel for 12 years, she told Brennan. "Never seen anything like this. People come here sad and leave happy. They come here sick and leave healthier. I'm not a religious woman, but I know something special is happening." The phenomenon had caught the attention of regional media. A television reporter from the nearest city had spent 2 days in Millbrook, interviewing residents and documenting the community changes. Her story, broadcast during prime-time news, brought even more visitors. James found himself uncomfortable with the attention. He'd agreed to one television interview, speaking quietly about their experience while Elise held Sophie on her lap. But the idea of their family becoming a tourist attraction felt wrong, a commercialization of something sacred. "We need to be careful," he told Elise, after declining 3 more interview requests. "This was never about us becoming famous. It was about serving others." Elise agreed, but she also recognized their responsibility to share their story. "People are hurting everywhere, James. If hearing about what happened to us gives them hope, maybe that's part of why it happened." They reached a compromise. They would continue meeting with individuals who sought prayer or guidance, but they would limit media appearances and decline any offers for paid speaking engagements or book deals. The children were adapting to their unusual circumstances with varying degrees of comfort. Sophie enjoyed the attention, delighting in showing her drawings to visitors and telling anyone who would listen about the pretty lady who smells like flowers. Her innocent openness seemed to convince even the most skeptical adults. Mandy, however, was struggling with the loss of normalcy. At 10, she was old enough to understand that their family had become something of a phenomenon, but too young to fully process the implications. Her grades remained strong, but her teacher noted that she sometimes seemed distant, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. "People look at us differently now," Mandy confided to her father one evening. "At school, kids ask me if I can do miracles. I just want to be a regular kid." James felt his daughter's burden acutely. The Virgin Mary's blessing had restored their family's material circumstances, but it had also thrust them into a role they'd never sought. He wondered if this was how all chosen people felt, grateful for divine intervention, but overwhelmed by the responsibilities it brought. The answer came from an unexpected source. Father Rodriguez arranged for the family to meet Sister Elizabeth, an elderly nun who'd experienced her own Marian apparition 40 years earlier in Mexico. Sister Elizabeth had spent decades serving at a mission that grew up around her encounter, helping thousands of people while maintaining remarkable humility about her role. "The Blessed Mother doesn't choose us because we're special," Sister Elizabeth told Mandy during their private conversation. "She chooses us because we're ordinary. Special people might think the miracles come from them. Ordinary people know the miracles come through them." The distinction seemed to comfort Mandy. She began speaking about their experience differently, emphasizing that they were simply witnesses to something much larger than themselves. Meanwhile, Elise's cancer treatments had resumed, funded by Anonymous. Donations that arrived weekly in carefully calculated amounts. Dr. Peterson, her oncologist, was astounded by her improved condition. The aggressive cancer that had been progressing rapidly before treatment stopped was now in complete remission. "I've been practicing oncology for 25 years, Dr. Peterson told James privately. "I've seen spontaneous remissions before, but never in cases this advanced. Your wife should have been terminal months ago. Instead, she's healthier than she's been in years." The medical miracle added another layer to their story, but it also raised questions about the nature of divine intervention. If the Virgin Mary could heal Elise's cancer, why didn't she heal everyone? If miracles were possible, why were they apparently selective? James brought these questions to Father Rodriguez, seeking theological guidance that might help him understand their role in God's larger plan. Mystery is part of faith, the priest explained. We're not meant to understand everything about how God works. We're meant to trust that every experience, suffering and healing, loss and restoration, serves a purpose we may not see immediately. The conversation helped James accept the inexplicable aspects of their situation. They'd been chosen not to solve the mystery of divine intervention, but to participate in it. Their role was to remain open to whatever service was asked of them, whether that meant prayer with struggling families, testimony to skeptics, or simply living as examples of how faith could transform ordinary lives. As December approached, bringing the anniversary of their darkest days, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with losing everything and finding something infinitely more valuable. Their family had become a bridge between heaven and earth, helping others discover that miracles were not just possible, but happening all around them, waiting to be recognized by anyone willing to believe. The medical file that changed everything was marked with a single word in red ink: terminal. Thomas Brennan discovered it during his systematic investigation, buried in insurance records that Elise had signed releases for months earlier. When he brought the file to James and Elise's motel room on a grey December morning, the room fell silent, except for the sound of Sophie's crayons scratching across paper. "I need you to look at this," Brennan said, his usual skeptical confidence replaced by something approaching awe. The original diagnosis from Dr. Peterson's office, dated September 20th, 3 weeks before your reported encounter. James. Read the file twice before its implications fully registered. Stage 4 breast cancer, metastasized to lymph nodes and liver. Estimated survival time, 4 to 6 weeks. Treatment recommendation, palliative care only. The oncologist's notes were clinically precise and devastating. Patient has been informed that curative treatment is no longer viable. Focus should shift to comfort measures and family preparation. Elise sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. "I never told you," she whispered to James. "Dr. Peterson said there was no point in aggressive treatment. He said we should focus on making our remaining time meaningful." "Remaining time?" James's voice cracked. "You were dying and you didn't tell me? I didn't want our last weeks together to be about death. I wanted them to be about love." Tears slipped down Elise's cheeks. "I knew we were losing the bakery, losing our home. I thought if I could just hold on until we figured out the practical things, maybe I could find a way to tell you." Brennan cleared his throat softly. "Your most recent test results show complete remission. No trace of cancer anywhere in your body. Dr. Peterson's office has no medical explanation for the reversal." The revelation recontextualized everything. The Virgin Mary hadn't appeared to a struggling family facing hardship. She'd appeared to a family facing death. Elise's quiet strength during their homeless weeks hadn't been optimism. It had been the grace of someone who thought she was living her final days on earth. "The night she appeared," Elise said slowly, "I was praying for time, not for healing, because I'd accepted that wasn't possible. I was praying for enough time to see you and the girls safe before I died." James felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Every conversation, every decision, every moment of their recent journey took on new meaning. His wife hadn't just been poor, she'd been dying. The Virgin Mary hadn't just restored their circumstances, she'd restored Elise's life. Sophie looked up from her drawing. "Mama, are you not sick anymore?" "No, sweetheart, Mama's not sick anymore because the pretty lady made you better." Elise knelt beside her youngest daughter. "Yes, I think that's exactly what happened." Brennan's investigation had uncovered other revelations. Sophie's first encounter with the Virgin Mary hadn't been their family prayer that October night. The 8-year-old had been seeing the figure regularly for weeks before, always in dreams that felt more real than waking life. "I thought everyone had dreams about pretty ladies who smelled like flowers," Sophie explained matter-of-factly when questioned. "She told me Mama was going to be okay, but I had to keep it secret until the right time." Mandy's revelations were equally startling. Her ability to sense when families needed help wasn't intuitive, it was visionary. She'd been receiving specific information about neighbors' struggles through dreams that provided names, addresses, and detailed descriptions of various needs. "The dreams started right after Mama got really skinny," Mandy told her parents. "A voice would tell me about families who were sad or hungry or scared. Then I'd tell you, and somehow help would come to them." James struggled to process his daughter's supernatural experiences alongside the revelation of his wife's terminal diagnosis. His children had been carrying divine secrets while he worried about mortgage payments and business licenses. His wife had been facing death while he complained about their circumstances. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. "Because you weren't ready," Elise said gently. "You needed to lose everything else first. You needed to understand that our real wealth was never the bakery or the house. Our real wealth was always each other, and the opportunity to serve God through loving other people." The medical miracles confirmation sent shockwaves through Millbrook and beyond. Dr. Peterson provided written testimony about Elise's impossible recovery. The oncologist, a man of science who rarely discussed religious matters, found himself telling colleagues that he'd witnessed something beyond medical explanation. "In 30 years of practice, I've never documented a case where stage 4, metastatic, breast cancer simply vanished," he wrote in his official report. "Mrs. Miller's recovery defies every understanding we have of cancer progression and treatment. Her most recent scans show not just remission, but the complete absence of any evidence that cancer was ever present in her body." The revelation transformed public perception of the Miller family's story. What many had seen as a heartwarming tale of community support for a homeless family was now understood as something far more profound. A documented case of divine healing that challenged the boundaries between faith and medicine. Thomas Brennan's investigation report, initially intended for his own intellectual satisfaction, was now being requested by medical journals, theological institutions, and government health agencies. The businessman who'd started as a skeptic found himself at the center of a phenomenon that demanded belief in the impossible. "I've spent my career dealing in facts, in provable realities," Brennan told the growing crowd of reporters who descended on Millbrook. "The facts in this case point to one inescapable conclusion. Something miraculous occurred on October 15th, and its effects are continuing to unfold." The Vatican investigation team arrived earlier than scheduled. Father Miguel Santos, a senior investigator specializing in reported miracles, brought a team of medical experts, theologians, and researchers. Their mandate was to determine whether the events in Millbrook met the Church's strict criteria for authenticating supernatural phenomena. The investigation's scope expanded when Father Santos learned about Sophie's detailed drawings and Mandy's prophetic dreams. The Church had documented cases of children receiving divine visions, but rarely with such specific and verifiable outcomes. "We're not just investigating a single apparition," Father Santos explained to local church leadership. "We're investigating what appears to be an ongoing divine intervention affecting an entire community. The implications are extraordinary. Media attention intensified dramatically. National news networks sent correspondents to document the Millbrook miracles. The sidewalk where the Virgin Mary had appeared became a pilgrimage site, with hundreds of visitors arriving daily to pray and seek their own encounters with the divine. James and Elise found themselves overwhelmed by the attention, while simultaneously feeling called to serve the pilgrims who sought them out. Their motel room became an informal counseling center where desperate families shared their own struggles and asked for prayers. "We never expected this," James told Father Santos during his formal interview. We thought we were receiving a private blessing. We didn't realize we were being chosen to serve as witnesses for others. The weight of their calling became clear when 3 separate families reported their own miraculous healings after praying at the Millbrook site. A young boy's leukemia went into sudden remission. An elderly woman's Alzheimer's symptoms dramatically improved. A veteran's PTSD, chronic for 20 years, resolved after a single night of prayer on the sidewalk where the Miller family had encountered the Virgin Mary. Each new miracle brought more visitors, more scrutiny, and more responsibility. The small town's infrastructure strained under the influx of pilgrims. Local businesses experienced unprecedented prosperity, but the spiritual demands on the Miller family grew exponentially. Sophie and Mandy struggled with their roles as child visionaries. Reporters wanted interviews about their dreams and visions. Religious scholars analyzed their artwork and prophecies. Child psychologists evaluated their mental health and developmental progress. "I just want to play with my friends," Mandy confided to her parents after a particularly intense day of interviews. "Everyone thinks I'm supposed to know things I don't understand." The family faced a crucial decision: retreat from public attention to protect their children's normalcy, or embrace their role as instruments of divine will, despite the personal cost. The answer came during their evening prayers, when Sophie spoke with the matter-of-fact certainty that had characterized all her supernatural experiences. "The pretty lady says we're almost ready for the big test. After that, everything will be different, but we'll still be together." When pressed for details about this big test, Sophie could only say that it would happen when lots of people were watching, and that they needed to trust completely in God's plan. James and Elise exchanged glances over their daughter's head. They'd learned to trust Sophie's visions, even when, especially when, they didn't understand what they meant. That night, as Millbrook prepared for what would prove to be the most extraordinary day in its history, the Miller family knelt together around the blue rosary that had started their journey. They prayed for strength, for wisdom, and for the grace to serve whatever purpose God had chosen them to fulfill. Outside their motel room, pilgrims maintained prayer vigils through the night. Inside, a family that had lost everything and found something infinitely more valuable prepared for their ultimate test of faith. The medical file marked terminal sat on the nightstand, a reminder that their story had always been about more than losing and regaining a bakery. It had been about discovering that miracles were not just possible, but actively present in a world that had forgotten how to recognize them. Tomorrow would bring the Vatican's final interviews, international media coverage, and the mysterious big test that Sophie had prophesied. Tonight, they were simply a family grateful to be together, aware that their ordinary love had become a window through which others could glimpse the extraordinary love of God. The letter from the Vatican arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who waited for James's signature with the solemnity of someone handling state secrets. The official papal seal, impressed into cream-colored paper, felt weighty in James's hands, not just physically, but with the implications of what it represented. The Holy See announces a formal investigation into the claimed supernatural phenomena occurring in Millbrook, James read aloud to his family. A team of medical experts, theologians, and church officials will conduct final interviews beginning December 20th, with public observations to conclude on December 23rd. December 20th was 3 days away. December 23rd would mark exactly 9 weeks since their first encounter with the Virgin Mary. The letter's formal language couldn't disguise the magnitude of what was happening. The Catholic Church, an institution that approached reported miracles with legendary skepticism, was preparing to make an official determination about their experiences. Centuries of church history showed that authentic miracles were acknowledged. Rarely, and only after exhaustive investigation. What happens if they decide it wasn't real? Mandy asked, her 10-year-old mind grasping the stakes involved. Father Santos, who had become a regular presence in their daily lives, answered gently, "The church doesn't decide whether miracles are real, sweetheart. The church investigates whether reported miracles meet specific criteria for authentication. Your experiences were real, regardless of official recognition." But James understood his daughter's concern. Vatican authentication would transform their story from local phenomenon to globally recognized miracle. Rejection would cast doubt not just on their experiences, but on the healing and transformation that had affected hundreds of people. The media attention had reached extraordinary levels. International news crews filled Millbrook's few hotels, while satellite trucks lined the streets around the original site of their encounter. The small town had become the center of worldwide attention, with pilgrims arriving from dozens of countries to witness what many were calling the most significant Marian apparition in decades. Thomas Brennan, the former skeptic who'd become one of their strongest advocates, was managing media relations and crowd control. His investigation report had been translated into 12 languages and was being studied by religious scholars worldwide. "I've documented over 300 instances of unexplained phenomena connected to your family's experience," he told James. "Healings, prophetic dreams, sudden conversions, acts of extraordinary generosity. The pattern is consistent and verifiable. Whatever happened here on October 15th has created a ripple effect that continues expanding." The pressure on the Miller family had become intense. Vatican investigators conducted hours of interviews each day, probing every detail of their encounters with scientific precision. Medical experts examined Elise's recovery with technology that could detect cellular changes invisible to conventional testing. Child psychologists evaluated Sophie and Mandy's visions using criteria developed over centuries of investigating supernatural claims. Dr. Andrea Rossi, the Vatican's chief medical investigator, was particularly interested in Elise's impossible recovery. "We found no trace evidence that cancer was ever present in your body," she told Elise after reviewing comprehensive test results. "Your cellular structure shows no signs of radiation damage, chemotherapy effects, or surgical intervention. It's as if the disease was completely removed without leaving biological memory of its presence." The investigation's thoroughness was both reassuring and exhausting. Every aspect of their lives was scrutinized, from financial records that proved they hadn't fabricated their homelessness to psychological evaluations that confirmed their mental stability. Sophie's artwork received particular attention from theological experts. Professor Marcus Benedetti, a specialist in religious iconography, spent hours analyzing her drawings with the intensity of someone studying ancient manuscripts. "Your daughter's imagery incorporates theological concepts that require graduate-level study to understand," he told James and Elise. "The positioning of figures, the symbolic use of color, the integration of Christological themes, these elements appear naturally in her work, as if she's accessing knowledge beyond her educational experience." Mandy's prophetic dreams were equally remarkable to investigators. The 10-year-old had accurately predicted 17 specific instances of community need, always providing enough detail for targeted assistance, but never revealing information that would violate individual privacy. It's as if she receives exactly the knowledge necessary to help others, without the burden of knowing more than a child should know, observed Dr. Julia Morrison, a child psychologist specializing in religious experiences. The children's supernatural gifts, documented and authenticated by experts, added credibility to their parents' claims while raising profound questions about divine communication in the modern world. Meanwhile, the town of Millbrook struggled with its transformation from forgotten community to international pilgrimage destination. Local businesses couldn't keep up with demand for food, lodging, and religious souvenirs. Traffic congestion made normal life difficult for residents. The quiet streets where families had walked peacefully were now filled with tour buses and crowds of strangers. Some residents embraced the change, seeing economic opportunity and spiritual significance in their town's new status. Others felt overwhelmed by the constant attention and longed for their previous anonymity. Mrs. Foster, the motel manager, found herself coordinating housing for Vatican officials and international reporters. "I never imagined our little motel would host church dignitaries," she told Elise with bemused pride. "But then again, I never imagined a lot of things that have happened since your family arrived." The most significant challenge came from an unexpected source. A group of Protestant ministers from neighboring cities had organized opposition to what they called Catholic superstition affecting their community. They planned counter-demonstrations during the Vatican's public observations, arguing that authentic divine communication came through Scripture rather than apparitions. Father Santos addressed the theological controversy with diplomatic patience. "Faith traditions may differ in their understanding of divine revelation," he said during a community meeting, "but all Christians share belief in God's active presence in human affairs. We're investigating whether specific events meet Catholic criteria for authentication, not making claims about how God chooses to communicate with all believers." James found himself caught between competing religious perspectives while trying to maintain focus on what mattered most, serving the people who sought their help. Families continued arriving daily, desperate for prayer, healing, and hope. Their needs transcended denominational differences and theological debates. "We didn't choose this role," James told Father Santos during one of their private conversations, "but we're here, and people are hurting, and somehow our story gives them hope. Whether the church officially recognizes what happened to us matters, less than whether we can continue helping others find their own encounters with God." The priest nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that perspective is itself evidence of authentic divine calling. Genuine mystics typically care more about serving others than about receiving official recognition. As December 23rd approached, bringing the Vatican's final public observation, Sophie's prophetic warnings about a big test took on new urgency. The 8-year-old remained calm about whatever was coming, but her parents felt the weight of worldwide attention focused on their family's faith. The test, whatever it would be, would determine not just the Church's official position on their experiences, but the future of a spiritual movement that had touched thousands of lives. In 3 days, their private miracle would face the most public scrutiny imaginable. They could only trust that the same divine presence that had sustained them through homelessness and skepticism would guide them through their greatest challenge yet. December 23rd dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the sidewalks of Millbrook like scattered diamonds. By 6 a.m., thousands of people had gathered around the site where the Miller family had first encountered the Virgin Mary. Pilgrims from around the world stood alongside local residents, Vatican officials, media representatives, and protesters in an unprecedented convergence of faith, skepticism, and hope. James stood with his family at the exact spot where they'd prayed 9 weeks earlier, acutely aware that every word and gesture was being recorded for history. Television cameras from 6 continents focused on their small group, while church officials maintained careful observation from a respectful distance. "I'm scared, Papa," Sophie whispered, pressing close to his side as she surveyed the enormous crowd. "It's all right, sweetheart," James replied, though his own heart was racing. "We're going to do exactly what we did that first night. We're going to pray together, and whatever happens after that is in God's hands." The morning had been filled with final preparations and instructions. Father Santos had explained the Vatican's observation protocol. They would document everything that occurred, but would not interfere with natural events. Dr. Rossi and her medical team stood ready to examine any physical phenomena. International reporters broadcast live coverage to audiences numbering in the millions. Thomas Brennan had worked tirelessly to maintain order among the massive crowd. Millbrook's small police force was supplemented by officers from surrounding counties, but the atmosphere remained peaceful, almost reverent. People seemed to sense they were witnessing something historic. At exactly 9 a.m., the same time their original encounter had occurred, the Miller family joined hands in prayer. The crowd fell silent, thousands of people holding their breath in anticipation. "Dear Lord," Elise began, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "we thank you for the many blessings you have given our family and this community. We thank you for bringing us together with all these people who seek to know you better." As she spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around them grew warm, impossible warm for a December morning. Those closest to the family felt it first. A gentle heat that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The warmth spread outward through the crowd, creating visible breath clouds as cold morning air met impossible warmth. "Look," someone called out, pointing skyward. Above them, the clouds were forming patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Swirling formations created shapes that resembled roses, doves, and flowing robes. Television meteorologists would later struggle to explain atmospheric conditions that produced such precise and meaningful patterns. Then, as hundreds of cameras recorded and thousands of witnesses watched, she appeared. The Virgin Mary materialized exactly as the Miller family had described, wearing robes of deepest blue trimmed with luminous white, her face radiant with infinite compassion. But this time, she was not appearing to a desperate family in solitude. She was manifesting before the largest gathering in Millbrook's history under the scrutiny of science and faith. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Many fell to their knees in spontaneous worship. Others wept openly. Some raised phones and cameras, though electronic devices seemed to malfunction in her presence, capturing only brilliant light where her figure should have been. Dr. Rossi, frantically, adjusted her instruments, recording temperature changes, electromagnetic fluctuations, and atmospheric phenomena that challenged scientific understanding. Her equipment detected energy signatures unlike anything in existing databases. The Virgin Mary raised her hands in blessing, encompassing not just the Miller family, but the entire gathered multitude. As she did, something unprecedented occurred. From the exact spot where she stood, a single white rose began to emerge from the concrete sidewalk. The rose defied every law of botany and physics. It pushed through solid pavement without cracking the surface, bloomed impossibly in freezing temperatures, and radiated the same ethereal light that surrounded the Virgin Mary's figure. Its petals were pure white, more brilliant than fresh snow, and its fragrance filled the air with sweetness that seemed to calm every heart present. Father Santos, maintaining his investigative composure despite personal amazement, approached the rose carefully. His trained eye noted details that would prove crucial to Vatican authentication. The flower showed no signs of artificial insertion, no tool marks in the pavement, no possibility of human manipulation. More remarkably, the rose's appearance seemed to trigger physical healings throughout the crowd. A woman who had arrived in a wheelchair stood and walked. A blind man began describing colors he could suddenly see. A child with cerebral palsy spoke clearly for the first time in her life. Dr. Rossi's medical team rushed to document each healing, finding inexplicable physiological changes that occurred instantaneously. Conditions that required months or years of treatment were resolving before their eyes. Thomas Brennan, the former skeptic who had become the Miller family's strongest advocate, found himself weeping as he witnessed his own transformation. The businessman who had built his life on rational explanations was experiencing something that transcended all logic. "I understand now," he whispered to James. "This was never about proving miracles exist. This was about discovering that we, Live in a world where miracles are normal, where God is actively present, where impossible things happen because love makes them possible. The Virgin Mary's presence lasted exactly 10 minutes, long enough for thousands of witnesses to experience. The impossible, short enough to preserve the mystery that makes faith necessary. As she began to fade, her final gesture was toward the white rose, which continued blooming even as her figure disappeared. The rose remained, growing impossibly from concrete, blooming perpetually despite seasons and weather, serving as permanent. Testament to a morning when heaven touched earth in Millbrook, transforming not just one desperate family, but thousands of lives forever. The aftermath of the public apparition transformed Millbrook permanently. Within hours of the Virgin Mary's appearance, the Vatican issued a preliminary statement acknowledging extraordinary events requiring further investigation. Father Santos, visibly moved by what he'd witnessed, told international media that the phenomena exceeded anything in church records. In 30 years of investigating reported miracles, he said, I have never documented anything approaching the scale and verifiability of today's events. Thousands of witnesses, multiple forms of physical evidence, documented healings. This represents a new paradigm in our understanding of divine intervention. The white rose became the focal point of worldwide attention. Botanists from major universities examined the flower, finding cellular structures that defied classification. The rose contained genetic markers from multiple species while belonging definitively to none. Its perpetual blooming violated every known law of plant biology. Dr. Rossi's medical team worked around the clock, documenting the healings that had occurred during the apparition. 37 cases of instantaneous recovery from serious conditions were verified through before and after medical records. The documentation process would take months, but preliminary findings suggested authentic miracles on an unprecedented scale. Thomas Brennan found himself at the center of a global phenomenon. His investigation report, combined with the day's documented events, provided the most comprehensive evidence of supernatural intervention in modern history. Publishers, documentary filmmakers, and academic institutions competed for rights to his research, but Brennan's focus remained on Millbrook's transformation. The businessman who had begun as a skeptic was now leading efforts to accommodate the thousands of pilgrims arriving daily. Infrastructure improvements, expanded medical facilities, and organized prayer services were necessary to handle the overwhelming response. This town needs to become what it's meant to be, he told the emergency city council meeting. Not just a tourist destination, but a genuine center for spiritual renewal. We have an opportunity to serve people's deepest needs. The Miller family discovered their role evolving beyond anything they had imagined. The deed to their original bakery building arrived by courier on December 30th, returned through an anonymous donation that covered all outstanding debts and renovation costs. We've been given our bakery back, James told Elise, as they stood before the building they'd lost 8 months earlier. But I don't think we're meant to just bake bread anymore. The building's restoration became a community project. Volunteers worked alongside professional contractors, transforming the space into something unprecedented. A combination bakery, community center, and informal shrine. The kitchen would produce bread for both commercial sale and free distribution to those in need. Meeting rooms would host prayer groups, counseling sessions, and support networks for struggling families. Sophie's artwork adorned the walls, her theological drawings now recognized as legitimate religious art. Museums had requested to display her work, but the family chose to keep the pieces in Millbrook, where they served their original purpose of helping people understand divine love. Mandy's prophetic gifts continued developing in remarkable ways. Her dreams now provided guidance not just for individual families, but for community-wide initiatives. She accurately predicted which families would be arriving each week, what kinds of assistance they would need, and how local resources could be mobilized most effectively. "It's like having a direct communication line with heaven," Elise marveled as she watched her daughter coordinate volunteer efforts with supernatural precision. The reopened bakery became the heart of Millbrook's transformation. James and Elise worked alongside volunteers from around the world, serving both tourists seeking spiritual experiences and locals navigating daily challenges. The building that had represented their greatest loss now symbolized restoration and service. Father Santos established a permanent Vatican office in Millbrook, recognizing that the phenomena surrounding the Miller family showed no signs of diminishing. Monthly apparitions continued, always witnessed by growing crowds, always accompanied by healings and conversions that defied explanation. The Protestant ministers who had initially opposed the Catholic pilgrimage site found themselves reconsidering. In their positions, Reverend William Foster, another member of the extensive Foster family network that seemed central to Millbrook's character, experienced his own spiritual transformation after witnessing one of the monthly apparitions. "I came here to debunk what I thought was superstition," he admitted during a joint interfaith service. "Instead, I encountered the living Christ in a way that transcended denominational boundaries. What's happening here belongs to all believers, not just Catholics." The white rose continued blooming through winter, spring, and summer, its presence a constant reminder that the impossible had become ordinary in Millbrook. Researchers from around the world studied the flower, but none could explain its perpetual vitality or its ability to bloom, regardless of weather conditions. Dr. Peterson, Elise's oncologist, established a research clinic adjacent to the bakery. His mission was to study the relationship between faith and healing, using Millbrook's unique environment to explore questions that conventional medicine couldn't address. "We're documenting recovery rates that shouldn't be possible," he told medical colleagues. "But the evidence is overwhelming. Something about this location, this community, these people, creates conditions where miraculous healing occurs regularly." As their first anniversary approached, the Miller family reflected on their extraordinary journey. They had lost a small business and gained a global ministry. They had experienced poverty and discovered wealth beyond measure. They had been chosen not for their perfection, but for their willingness to serve. The Virgin Mary had appeared to a desperate family on a cold sidewalk, and that single encounter had transformed a dying town into a beacon of hope for the world. 1 year later, on a crisp October morning, the Miller family gathered with hundreds of friends and volunteers outside their restored bakery for a photograph that would capture not just faces, but the transformation of an entire community. The new family photo would replace the old one James still carried in his wallet, the image of 4 people behind a bakery counter, innocent of the trials and miracles that awaited them. The rebuilt Miller's family bakery bore little resemblance to their original business. Where once they had served a neighborhood, they now served the world. The expanded kitchen produced thousands of loaves daily, feeding both paying customers and anyone who arrived hungry. The dining area accommodated pilgrims from every continent, creating a united nations of people seeking hope and healing. Elise moved through the busy kitchen with the energy of someone who had been given a second life. Her cancer remained in complete remission, a fact that continued to astound medical experts. More than physical healing, she radiated the joy of someone who understood that every day was a gift, every interaction an opportunity to serve. "Remember, when we worried about making enough money to keep the doors open?" she asked James, as they watched volunteers from 12 countries work alongside local residents to prepare the day's bread. "Now our biggest challenge is having enough space for everyone who wants to help." James nodded, still amazed by their journey's scope. The man who had once measured success in daily sales now measured it in lives touched, families helped, and hearts opened to possibility. The construction skills he'd developed at Patterson's company proved invaluable as they continued expanding their facilities to meet growing demand. Sophie, now 9, had become something of a local celebrity while remaining remarkably grounded. Her artwork was displayed in the Vatican Museum, but she was equally excited about helping Mrs. Williams stock the community food pantry. Visitors came from around the world to meet the child visionary, but Sophie treated everyone with the same friendly openness she'd always possessed. "I drew you a new picture," she told Dr. Rossi, who had returned for the anniversary celebration. The drawing showed the Virgin Mary, surrounded by people of all ages and nationalities, with golden threads connecting every heart to every other heart. "It's beautiful, Sophie. What do the golden threads represent?" "Love," Sophie answered simply. "The pretty lady showed me that everyone is connected by love, even when they don't know it yet." Mandy, now 11, had grown into her role as a bridge between the supernatural and the practical. Her prophetic dreams continued providing guidance for community decisions, but she also excelled in regular school subjects and maintained friendships with children her own age. The family had worked hard to ensure both daughters could experience normal childhood alongside their extraordinary gifts. "The dreams are getting different," she confided to her parents. "Instead of just showing me who needs help, they're showing me how people can help each other, like teaching everyone to be their own miracle workers." The transformation extended far beyond the Miller family. Millbrook had become a model for spiritual community development. The town's economy thrived, but not through exploitation of religious tourism. Instead, a sustainable network of faith-based businesses, social services, and educational programs had emerged. Thomas Brennan had used his business expertise to establish the Millbrook Foundation, ensuring that the community's growth served its spiritual mission rather than commercializing it. The foundation provided housing for long-term volunteers, scholarships for students interested in theology and social work, and grants for similar projects in other communities. "We're proving that miracles can be practical," Brennan told the anniversary gathering. "Divine intervention doesn't have to be mysterious and rare. It can be systematic, sustainable, and available to anyone willing to participate." The white rose continued blooming in its impossible concrete garden, now surrounded by a beautiful shrine that accommodated the thousands of people who came to pray daily. Scientists had given up trying to explain the flower's perpetual vitality, instead focusing on documenting the healings and conversions that occurred in its presence. Father Santos had been appointed to lead the church's new Institute for Contemporary Miracles, headquartered in Millbrook. His research team studied the relationship between faith, community, and supernatural phenomena, developing protocols that could be replicated in other locations. The Millbrook model demonstrates that authentic spiritual experiences create authentic social transformation, he wrote in his groundbreaking study. When people encounter the divine, they naturally begin serving others. When communities embrace service as their primary mission, they create conditions where further divine encounters become normal rather than exceptional. The anniversary celebration culminated with evening prayers at the original site of the Virgin Mary's appearance. Thousands of people gathered as the Miller family led the same prayer that had begun their extraordinary journey. As they joined hands in the familiar circle, now expanded to include friends from around the world, James reflected on the lessons of the past year. They had learned that losing everything could be the beginning of finding what really mattered. They had discovered that miracles weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of love's unlimited power. They had experienced firsthand that ordinary people could become conduits for extraordinary grace. "Thank you," James prayed aloud, "for choosing our family to learn that your love is always present, always active, always seeking opportunities to heal and transform. Thank you for teaching us that miracles happen when we open our hearts to serve others." As if in response to his gratitude, The evening air grew warm with familiar presence. Though the Virgin Mary didn't appear visibly this time, everyone present felt her blessing, her continuing guidance, her promise that love's work in Millbrook was just beginning. The new family photograph, taken later that evening, captured faces glowing with joy and purpose. But more than faces, it captured the truth they had discovered, that miracles don't end stories, they begin them. That divine encounters don't solve all problems, they reveal the power within ordinary people to solve problems for each other. 1 year after losing their bakery and finding something infinitely more valuable, the Miller family understood that their real mission was helping others discover their own capacity for miraculous living. The Virgin Mary had appeared to a desperate family, and through them reminded the world that love makes all things possible. Their story continued, one loaf of bread, one prayer, one act of service at a time.